Hey, welcome back to John chapter 11. As we come into this lesson today, I wanted to find, as I usually do, I try to find these images for you guys to be able to see just a little bit about what's going on. I've found that some people are visual learners, and so sometimes these images can be helpful, and other times not so much. And so I want to point these out as often as I can. This is a mural that's done depicting Jesus and Lazarus. And one of the things that I love about this, you'll notice that Lazarus is obviously the one in the burial clothes on the side. And you'll notice that because of the way this image is set up, he's out in the corner because the story isn't about Lazarus. It's about Jesus. And that really is the whole point of the story. And so the artist, I think rightly, puts Jesus and Jesus' outstretched hand front and center for this healing. And so I just wanted to point that out as you're looking at this image, something that I think that we can learn a little bit visually as well as from our ears and as we read with our eyes. And so it's fun to be able to see these images. Hopefully they're helpful for you as well. So as we get into this text, this is found in John chapter 11. As usual, we're going to read through all the verses, and so you'll get a read through of the entire thing here in John 11, and then we're going to do John 12 as well for this week. And so as we're focusing on this, notice that this story, this account, really is pretty much only made up of the death of Lazarus and his raising back to life. Spoiler alert, Lazarus is coming back. And so we look forward to that part in our text today. To give you guys a little bit of context, in John chapter 11, verses 1 and 2, we'll read those verses and then I'll talk a little bit about kind of what's going on around it. Now, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So I want you guys to notice a couple of things here. Bethany is about 2 miles from Jerusalem. We're going to find that out later in the text. And we're about to zoom in on the city of Jerusalem, beginning in chapter 12, really all the way through the rest of John's gospel. So we're going to spend a significant amount of time in text in Jerusalem. So we're going to zoom in on that. Also, we will read about the event talked about here, the pouring out of this perfume, in chapter 12. And so it seems like it's out of chronological order. What it is saying here is that John is writing this after the fact. So he knows some of the events, and he speaks to some of the events that have not happened yet chronologically. We can see that throughout the gospel in his discussion of Jesus dying on the cross, far before, obviously, that it happens. And that's the same thing that's going on here. So if you're getting a little bit confused as to why he's referencing a later event as if it had already happened, it's because he's writing after the fact. So that can be a little bit confusing. We don't do that a lot as English speakers, really more just because we don't have... we put a high emphasis on the chronology of events. So we want to tell a story starting in 1 AD, then 1.5 AD, and then 2 AD, and then thereon and there forth. But he doesn't necessarily do that. The Bible generally doesn't. So as you're reading through that, if you want to find a chronology, that's fine. But usually the Bible is putting these things in places for a reason and then talking about them later. So John is pulling a later event into earlier in the story to make sure people know who these people are, because this is important to the original readers. So make sure you're reading with context. That always helps us to determine the meaning of these passages that we're going through today. If you have any questions on that, ask me on Sunday or shoot a comment underneath this video. So as we get into verse 3, it says, so the sisters sent to him, that is Jesus, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. And right here we notice that they're sending this plea for help to Jesus, the only one who they know can save their brother. It also references that Jesus is close to this family. The one you love is ill. And so notice that that's happening here too. We're going to talk more about Jesus' relationships with people later in this text, but I want to point that out as kind of a little primer for us, that we're already seeing that Jesus was close with people during his lifetime as a person. And then we get Jesus' surprising reply in verse 4, but when Jesus heard it, he said, this illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it. And so we recognize, just like a couple of these other miracles that have been done, these are things that are happening for the glory of God. Not because somebody sinned, not because somebody did something wrong, but because God would be glorified through it. And so we get to see that his surprising reply is simply wait. Simply wait. And so he does. In verse 5, we'll begin to talk about the full humanity of Jesus. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. This is a full picture of the full humanity of Jesus. And throughout this chapter, we're going to see that John regularly highlights the deity of Jesus Christ. He's done that all throughout the book so far. But here in this account, this chapter 11, we really get an account of that highlights that he is truly a man. That he is truly this Son of Man that has come and will fulfill all of these prophecies. But we get this account that Jesus is truly man and yet also truly God. He feels deeply and yet knows the outcome. He controls everything and yet works in human events. It's amazing to watch as we go through the rest of this text today. So I want us to see that a little bit. Then we get a little bit more hurry up and wait in verses 6 through 10, as it says, "So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Then after this he said to the disciples, 'Let us go to Judea again.' The disciples said to him, 'Rabbi, the Jews were just now seeking to stone you, and are you going there again?' Jesus answered, 'Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of this world. But if anyone walks in the night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him.'" So notice what he's saying here. He's waiting. He's stalled. He's staying 2 days longer in the place where he was. And then he said, "Let's go back into Judea." What we don't see right now, but what we'll see soon, is that this is going to be the last time he enters this region. He's going into Judea, and then he's going into Jerusalem, and that is where we will see him be crucified. And so he hurries up and waits a little while. And sometimes I want to point out that the will of God happens on a different time than we would have it happen. And that's a truth that we have to recognize today. Sometimes things happen in our lives that God would be glorified. And that's okay. It's hard, it's difficult, but God has a plan for the life of every single one of us. Don't forget the purpose. This is done so that God may be glorified. And we're going to continue to see that refrain throughout this chapter. Don't forget that it's always done that God may be glorified. In verses 11 through 14, it says, "After saying these things, he said to them, 'Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him.'" Now that probably sounds kind of weird to the disciples, thinking, okay, well, why would you go travel 2 days to go wake someone up? But they're not getting the whole definition. The disciples said to him, "Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover." Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought he meant taking rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, "Lazarus has died." Now notice that Jesus shouldn't have known this anyways. No one had come to him and told him this. He just knew because he is God. And so he's doing all of this for a purpose. Jesus has had to explain to the disciples that Lazarus is dead, not simply recovering. And that's important because what he's about to go and do is going to change even further their perspective of him. John 11:15 references forward to the purpose of the book. It said, "And for your sake I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe in him, but let us go to him." Notice how that references forward. If you've been paying attention to John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, that's the purpose statement of the book, that these miracles that are contained in this book would cause people to believe in Christ, that they would change their lives and follow the Christ because of the miracles that are set forth in this section. And so I say that to notice that as we're going, we're constantly getting that refrain of this miracle happens for a purpose. And so we want to catch that when John inspired by the Holy Spirit, is saying that to us. And then we see our famous doubting Thomas, but not in his usual light. When we see doubting Thomas here, it actually should be said courageous Thomas, because he says in verse 16, so Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him. Notice that I think Thomas actually has the best idea at this point of what's happening. He gets it. He says, if we go back to Jerusalem, we're going to die. Someone's dying in Jerusalem. And at least he's recognizing that. And so we get a little bit of foreshadowing here happening from Thomas. In 17 through 19, we get a little bit of an example of how Lazarus was dead. And I don't say that really as a joke, but that's the best way I can put it, is that he's dead, but he's not just dead like a couple minutes ago. He's like dead, like 4 days old dead. It says, now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So notice, Lazarus is dead. Not kind of dead. There's no chance he was still alive. I want to make that clear, and that sounds redundant, but that's what the text is saying. He is deader than a doornail dead. And the reason for that is that Jewish superstition held that a soul stayed near its body for 3 days. I don't know how they got to this point, but that was a common Jewish superstition. Even though it's not true, it's not biblical that happens, they thought it was happening. And so Jesus waits to make sure that they don't think that anything else could have brought Lazarus back. Jesus wanted the crowds to be sure that this was a true miracle, not something like CPR or a resuscitation. This is a true back from the dead miracle. And so he makes sure that the time has passed for that. And yet, it still has not happened, even though we're talking about it a little bit like it already has. In verses 20 through 27, Martha asks a faithful question, even in her grief, and Jesus gives a wonderful answer. It says, so when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Isn't that amazing? Martha knows that even if Jesus were to ask that her brother would be revived, resurrected, that he could do it. That's the kind of faith that Martha asks this question out of. And we're going to see where this faith comes from later on in this chapter and in chapter 12. But I think it's important that we notice that this faith is asking, it's faithful. It knows that Jesus can do whatever he wills. And so out of that faith, something is asked. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. She has a good idea of what the theology of Judaism says, that we will all rise on the resurrection on the last day. But Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? And listen to her response. She said to him, yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. That is an amazing statement of faith in who Jesus is. And so something is about to happen because Jesus is going to do something. He's going to do his last miracle, his 7th sign in this before his own resurrection later on. When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, the teacher is here and is calling for you. And when she heard it, she rose quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. So recognize what's going on. A little more context to set up here, that Mary is going to meet Jesus, but the Jews don't know this because it's been told to her in private. And so, in 32, now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. She's broken. She's saddened. She's in anguish about this. But she knows that if Jesus had been there, he could have saved him. But she hasn't quite gotten the same way as Martha yet. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." And then he comes and he sees. And it says in the shortest verse in the Bible, verse 35, Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying?" I want to point out something that's going on in this text. That was a larger block of text. But I want you to notice the interactions and relationships that Jesus has with the people who he is ministering with. Jesus interacts with people by the relationships which he develops with them. Now that seems really obvious, right? That seems like a really easy thing to glean from this text. But we don't understand how amazing that is. What a miracle that is, that happens in God's Word. Imagine that God the Son taking the time to develop a relationship of his own creation. God the Son has taken the time to develop a relationship with his own creation such that he weeps when he sees that his friend is dead. That is amazing. God cares so much for us that he was willing to take on these human emotions, this fragile state in which he cries over his friends. That's the kind of love that God shows to us, yet while we were still sinners. And I want you guys to notice that that's going on here in the text today. Verse 37, what do you think Jesus is going to do? There's a little foreshadowing by John here, but some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying? Well, could he? Let's find out in the next section of verses. John 11:38 through 44 says, Then Jesus, deeply moved again, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone lay against it. If you've read the Passion narrative, are you recognizing anything? There's a stone laid against a cave, and it's a tomb, and in that tomb is a dead body. Now, what do you think is going to happen to that dead body? Jesus said, Take away the stone. Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days. Jesus said to her, Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? Notice what's going on here, that this body was decomposing. It was broken. It was dead at a cellular level. There was no oxygen left. This man was so very dead. And yet Jesus is about to do something amazing. And I want us to point out here something, that we are all dead in our sins. And yet Jesus resurrects us. That is amazing truth today. But as we jump back into the text in 41, so they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this on account of the people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, and his face wrapped with a cloth. Jesus said to them, Unbind him and let him go. As possibly, as the verse is ending, and now I'm commentating on it, that is possibly the greatest walk-off moment. He just says, let him go. This is a miracle, and the last miracle that we'll get to see before Jesus' own resurrection much later in the book. Notice what's going on right in the verses after that, because I would imagine that there'd be no way you could doubt what was going on. We've had discussions in this Sunday school class about how would we not believe in God if we saw the Red Sea parted. Well, these people find a way not to believe in him, even though they've seen the dead be raised. In verse 45 and 46, many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. So the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we going to do? For this man performs many signs." Now, notice I read one verse a little bit too far, but as we're reading through verses 45 and 46, you'll notice that over and over we're going to see throughout the book of John this duality of good and evil. Now, we don't believe in dualism, that good and evil are equal, but John uses this term. John doesn't use this term. We use this term to describe John, that he's dualistic, which just means that there is a good and an evil in battle, and they're different, and there's nothing in the middle. There's no gray area. There's no fence sitting for the people of God. You can either be against God or for him, and we see that here in 45 and 46. Some believe, but some do not, and that's just the reality throughout the Gospel of John. In verses 47 through 48, I already read 47, but I will read 48 really quickly. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Jesus' signs are deeply, deeply convincing, but some will never believe in him for salvation. We're going to see a couple examples of people that believe in him for a little while and then fall away. But they won't believe in him for salvation. Even though his signs are clear, they're obvious, and they're believable. They just don't. And that's the reality with some people that we will encounter in our lifetime. And that is a really hard reality, but it is something that we have to come to grips with at some points in this story, because some people will not follow him. But that doesn't mean those people are outside of the will of God. We're about to see one of these wicked people being used for the glory of God. Verses 49 through 53. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, "You know nothing at all, nor do you understand that it is better for you that one man should die for the people, not that the whole nation should perish." Wow, that sounds pretty good. But Caiaphas does not mean this in the right way. We'll keep reading. He did not say this of his own accord, says verse 51, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. So from that day on, they made plans to put him to death. Notice what he just said contradicts what he does, because God is prophesying through this man who is the high priest at the time. We'll go into that a little bit later when we talk about the Sanhedrin and the councils and the people that judge, that wind up trying to put Jesus to death. But the important thing to notice here is that this is a man who should be holy, and God is prophesying through this man, even though this man is wicked through and through. The high priest meant this for evil, but God will use it to accomplish his plan. Caiaphas is responsible for his sin. Don't forget that. Don't think that God is puppeteering Caiaphas to do this. He wants to sin. That's every one of us before we believe, that we want to sin more than anything else. And he wants to do it, but God's plan still comes to pass. This was still the plan from the beginning, that Jesus would die on the cross for the sins of all human beings. And then all those who believe in him. I want to make that very clear. And then we get into verse 54 through 57, reading through the book. And this is the conclusion of the book of signs that we've been going through, these 7 signs. And if you want to look at through each of those again, either go to the prologue video and you'll see all of those, or just go back and watch each video as you see all the signs in their teaching. And it says in verse 54, Jesus therefore no longer walked openly among the Jews, but went from there to the region near the wilderness, to a town called Ephraim, and there he stayed with the disciples. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and many went up from the country to Jerusalem before the Passover to purify themselves. They were looking for Jesus and saying to one another as they stood in the temple, "What do you think, that he will not come to the feast at all?" Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where he was, he should let them know so that they might arrest him. Now, we've got only a little bit of time, probably about a week, until the Passover, where we come into our longest stretch of the book and in the shortest time. We're going to cover about a week over about 8 or 9 chapters. So get ready to hang on for a little bit. We're going to get super detailed, get into a lot of teaching, and we're really excited about being able to do that today. Again, here's your last view of that picture, and if you pause it right here, you can look at the picture as long as you would like.